Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this geopolitical discussion of the geopolitics of the post-Soviet region. Today, we are going to talk about the changing nature of alliances and defense trade in the former Soviet Union. Obviously, driven by the importance of the war, we are going to discuss first the strategic importance of the region, which may not be obvious to everybody, if it is not obvious to everybody yet. The changing nature of alliances and defense partnerships, especially drawing attention to the examples of Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Moldova. Then we're going to think about the options that the EU and NATO have and how they can prepare themselves for the future in Europe. Finally, we're going to think about some lessons learned from Ukraine and how we can adapt production and logistics to wartime. And we are going to talk about what NATO can do with Russia, lessons learned from Ukraine, and the reflections of future scenarios. We're going to do so with our... this is it. I am turning the slides for myself, but not for you. Here we go. This is our... We're going to do so with our four speakers. First, we are going to open the topic on the regional alliances with Gabriel Valli, here present. Gabriel is a vice president of the think tank Eastern Circles, which we represent together and which is the organizer of the panel. We are a geoeconomics think tank working on energy and defense in the post-Soviet space. Gabriel is a graduate of Sciences Po University and an exchange student with MGIMO, so she knows the Russians from inside, so to say, with a work experience in Russia and the Caucasus for the French Defense and Foreign Affairs Ministries. We're going then continue about what should NATO and Europe do together inside Europe to prepare for the future with General Dominique Trinquant. Graduate of the Military Academy of Saint-Cyr and École Supérieure de la Guerre of Paris, the staff, he is teaching in the College of Camberley and the Royal College of Defence Studies of London. General Trinquant's career has spanned postings of regiments, high-level staff duties, roles within international organizations. He took part in military operations in Lebanon, ex-Yugoslavia, and Africa, with solid experience in international relations in a multinational environment at the UN, the EU, and NATO. Thank you, General. We are going to then continue to talk about adjusting logistics in the conditions of war based on true-life examples of Losberger de Boer, represented here by Gilles de Pailleret. After a career as an officer and more than 20 years on board of a French Navy ships and submarines, Gilles Bonnet de Pailleret continued his career in the military industry. He worked for Naval Group and Westinghouse Electric Company as Rapid Deployment System Unit Manager, Managing Director, and General Manager of Bachmann RDS. Now he's working for Losberger de Boer and is now dedicated to supporting those who are deployed to protect their country. Gilles will share with us his experience in Ukraine. We're finally going to conclude on what should NATO do with Russia. What are the options and future scenarios? And this we're going to do with General Michel Yakovlev, who's Lieutenant General of the French Army, who retired after 40 years of service as an Army and a 3-star Vice Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. He served under the Allied Powers Europe also as a Vice Chief of Staff for the Supreme Commandment of Allied Powers. He also served at the Joint Force Command in Brussels and was a member of the Committee for Independent Fight Against Corruption, NACO, in Kiev, an initiative of Transparency International supported by the British and American establishment as well, from September 2018 to January 2020. Today, General Yakovlev is a professor in Sciences Po Paris and the Special Military School of Saint-Cyr, and he is responsible for the politics major in the National Institute of Haute Défense Nationale. He is also the author of an iconic book, a textbook on tactics, which several of you or many of you might know, which is called Tactique théorique. Thank you. We're going to start with maybe a reminder for some or just a few numbers for others about the strategic importance of the region. When we talk about the post-Soviet region that engulfs today 14 different independent states, 3 of which, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, are part of the European Union. Well, others are not. And hence, you have those red triangles all over the map. Those are indicative of the Russian military bases in the region. The region which in itself, economically nor demographically, doesn't represent much. It is only under 4% of the world's population. It is only above 3% of the world's GDP. Yet, it is a thorn in the thigh of so many people, especially and the place and the ground of the hottest war on the European continent since World War II today. It is also a key energy resource provider and the key energy hub, not only to Europe, which now we're very well aware of, but also to Asia. It is a major drug trafficking hub through Central Asia, from Afghanistan to Western Europe and the rest of the world. And it is a place to 4 frozen conflicts and 1 very hot war that we've just mentioned, as well as home to the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. All of this due to the presence of the biggest country, which is Russia, which we're all too well familiar with, which views the rest of the region and the rest of the countries not so much as independent states, but as groups. This was animation, but as groups of geopolitical, of its own geopolitical influence. We can say that if we look at the region with Russian eyes, we can divide it into the countries of it into 4 groups. One would be called the Westerners, those countries which have already joined NATO. We mentioned them, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, versus the rebels who used to be part of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire or both, but now want to join Western institutions. And the 3 most prominent representatives would be, of course, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. To the shifters, the people who do not openly proclaim their desire of any independence from Russia and who actually most of who house Russian military bases or military installations. However, we observe they are turning more and more toward China and increasingly Turkey in their respectively trade and defense relations. And finally, captive customers of Russia who depend fully on it for their economics and their defense, such as Armenia and Belarus. A single outlier is Azerbaijan. It's there as a little star in the right upper hand corner. It is a country which is fully economically independent and until October 2020 militarily independent from Russia. However, since that time, it has has had to house on its territory about 2,000 Russian troops after it has reignited the conflict with Armenia in 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh. Looking at these countries, in the words of, I want to remind 2 expressions. One, of course, one is the expression which is less known, of a very famous Russian oligarch of the 90s, who now lives in Nice, France, who said in a very long interview he recently gave that for Putin, a leader of a former Soviet republic is not a leader of a country. He is rather an equivalent of a head of a Russian region. For Putin, even a leader of European states is not necessarily equal to himself, as he himself has noted in the recent address to the public, which takes usually 5 hours on the phone, and the press conference is a very long address he did just before the end of the year, where he referred to European countries as small countries, which used to be big empires, but now are just relatively small countries. And finally, to close with the quote by Vladimir Putin himself, which is a very famous quote he gave in the early 2000s when he just became president of Russia, when he said that the fall of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It is precisely this, when we have this in mind, that explains what we're seeing today. And what we're seeing today is the diversion of priorities. The region is an absolute priority for Russia. The region and among the countries of the region, the absolute top priority is Ukraine, both by its economic, population, and by its geographical and strategic location. And the contrast we're seeing, of course, when we're looking at the war and everything that we're going to be discussing is going to come to this, is that for Europe, however, the region is not at all a priority. And this, of course, defines how each side takes up the war, how each side takes up also its approach to the region. When we look back at the map we've just seen, Russian approach can be more characterized with the opposite direction, with realist methodology. It applies political realism to its vision of the region, hence it approaches the region from the military perspective, having 4 military bases and thousands of troops in 2 more countries, and de facto using also Belarus today as a military ground and launching war in Ukraine. The European Union, however, is applying more what in political theory would be called a liberalist perspective, trying to fight a machine gun with a euro banknote. Whether this is effective or not, and where it brings us in the future, we are going to discuss with our dear guests. And with this, give the word to Gabriel Bali about the shifting alliances in the region.
Thank you very much. So are you going to take care of the slides? Yes, great. So I'm going to jump in the conversation with a very, very short storytelling, just to tell you that I decided to share with you food for thought instead of, a lecture, because while preparing this conference, I've been calling dozens of companies, I've been reading books, and it just became obvious to me that even though the invasion of Ukraine is a major geopolitical shift, it's going to have a long-term impact over the region and on the relations of the regional countries between themselves, but also with the rest of the world. For many companies and governments, we're still not really sure about how to make our strategies evolve. How is this going to impact our interest? And this is why, it's too early to draw final conclusions, but it's very important to do this prospective analysis now, because we need to challenge ourselves and we need to get prepared, to what's going to be unfolding in the following month. So I'm going to share with you, let's say, 5 key findings based on long-term analysis of, long-term trends in the region, as well as on the analysis of weak signals that have simply, caught our attention in the previous month and weeks, because they were disruptive or very surprising. And this is how we decided that we're not sure about how is it going to evolve in the future, but this is really important to have in mind. So these are the five key points I wanted to share with you. I'm taking back my notes. But first of all, we know that Russia has been losing influence for the past decades. And for us, the invasion of Ukraine completes this long-term process of Russia losing influence. Second, Moscow knew it. The third point is going to be that we must expect an increased security demand coming from the region. The fourth point is that, as you know it, what does nature hate? Nature hates void, which means that if a power is losing ground, this vacuum is going to be filled by other powers. And the question is just, by which powers? Which leads me to the final point. It has already started in the past, and the way it keeps going right now is similar and has been similar in between several countries, and I'm going to take the example of Kazakhstan for this. So, first of all, the first part. So, Russia's influence has been decreasing for years, and if we know that, Putin's goal is to restore the greatness of the USSR, or at least of Russia, it's leading right now to the total opposite. So what does it mean? very concretely, it means that, facing this loss of influence, Russia has tried to use different means, different strategies. So be it economic ties, being the security provider of many countries in the region, it has been by nurturing ties with the elites, sometimes by a kind of passive-aggressive discourse and relation with the countries. For instance, by stating that Ukraine is just a region, by constantly repeating that finally the territorial integrity of Kazakhstan is maybe not something that is that sure, or that it's maybe not really a country. And this has been consistent since 2014 and even since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine this year. Just because 18% of ethnic Russians do live in Kazakhstan. So what I mean by this is that for all those countries in the region, this is a real culture where, the trust has been broken. You cannot believe the representative of the Russian Foreign Affairs telling you that nothing is going to happen to Kazakhstan or nothing is going to happen to Transnistria, when those exact same people were telling you some months ago that no, nothing is going to happen to Ukraine. We're just exercising. It's lost. The trust has been lost. Moscow has turned into a direct threat to its neighbors. And Moscow has turned into a toxic partner. So it not yet, but sorry. So Moscow has turned into a toxic partner. So what does it mean? It means that even for countries not being too, not voicing too loud their concern about the invasion of Ukraine, it's important to show that they must not be put in the same bucket as Russia, because they might fall under Western sanctions just as Belarus. Belarus has been targeted automatically by the sanctions taken against Russia, and this is a threat to those countries. They must avoid this. So we have seen communication campaign launched in different European media, for instance, by Kazakhstan this March, to show that they don't want to fall into, on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain again. So that's very interesting. It's important to distantiate themselves from Russia. The second thing is that Moscow probably grasped that that would be very detrimental to its influence in the region. And for this, I'm going to quote an example, which is Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan, very interesting case. This is a country which is, let's say, economically powerful because of energy resources, and it has developed very strong ties, military ties, diplomatic ties with Turkey. Turkey, which has backed Azerbaijan in the 2020 war. And just 2 days before the war, Vladimir Putin and Ilham Aliyev met and signed a declaration on Halid interaction. So this is basically a document providing for the deepening of military ties, military exercises, and let's say consistent contact and dialogue between the two presidents to enhance cooperation. And that's something very surprising, which to us meant that Russia was trying to secure support, at least communication support, before the war in Ukraine, and as well to somehow counter the influence of Turkey in Azerbaijan. So the third point, which is, I guess, a very important one that we must think about, and especially, as people coming from the West, is that this war, the new level of this war, high intensity one, is going to lead to major security demands from the region. So concretely, what does it mean? It means that for those countries, first of all, defense budgets are either already increasing or they're going to increase. Second, and this is much more interesting when it comes to geopolitics and political alliances, for those countries, the way they look at security is going to change. For instance, if you take Moldova, Moldova is a country which has already economically totally reoriented towards the EU. It doesn't need the Russian market at all. It's really integrated into Europe, but by constitution since 1994, this is a neutral country. Neutral country till February 2022. It meant that Moldova wasn't supposed to join NATO or to get too close to NATO as opposed to Georgia or Ukraine. And it was, the security guarantee of Moldova. And right now, this conflict is changing this totally. Now, the authorities in Moldova are rewriting the defense strategy. And for them, neutrality doesn't mean being alone. It doesn't mean having no army. It means, having partners. And for this, they're going to get to find help through the European Peace Facility and get military equipment. And the NATO question is going to be reopened. So it leads me to the fourth point, which is that, once again, if a power is losing ground, other powers are going to get back to the region. And this is just to show you that, going back to Kazakhstan, for years, Moscow was the security provider of this region, was, the main arm exporter to most of the countries. So this is a very illustrative example. And we don't have to look too far to see reassurance of the fact that Moscow was important for the country. In January 2022, social unrest have shaken, have shaken Kazakhstan. And at some point, the government was even afraid of being overthrown. And while Turkey offered its assistance, saying that they would align all the means that are needed to protect Kazakhstan, Kazakh president called Russia to intervene through the OTSC, not any other country. So that was a message. And we've been all surprised to see that Russian troops left, because usually when they go somewhere to ensure peace, they don't leave. But they left, and our guess is that this is because Kazakhstan has always nurtured, let's say, a multi-vector diplomacy and be close enough to China. But just to show you that things are evolving, and this is also going to be my fifth point, I'm going to once again talk about Kazakhstan, and this time about Kazakhstan and Turkey. So you have understood that this January, Turkey wasn't the main priority, and you've seen on the graph that Turkey has never been a military, let's say, big military supplier for Kazakhstan. But despite all of this, I guess the country understood that it's risky to keep going in the same direction, and I feel like it's going to be the same thought for the countries of the region. So Kazakh president paid an official visit to Turkey, the first official visit of the current president in office since 2019. And it wasn't just a visit, to shake hands and to be happy to be in Turkey. It ended up being a very strategic and meaningful visit, because they signed an agreement on enhanced military cooperation, and they're actually not only going to buy Anka drones produced by Turkish aerospace, but they're going to produce them in Kazakhstan. And I mean, this is very surprising. And if, S-400 are a diplomatic tool of Russia for its, military cooperation, this is the case of the drones for Turkey. So Turkey has been selling drones recently to other Central Asian republics, is going to produce some in Kazakhstan, and for us it means a lot, because it means that this would have never happened before. It did not happen before in this part of the Russian backyard, and this is a message addressed to Moscow, and it also means that countries are going to either turn towards the West, either try to reinforce this multi-vector diplomacy. And for those turning towards the West, and then I will pass the floor to our other participant, because this is pretty much what they're going to discuss. But when I'm talking about security demand, this is just a demand, it's just like, putting their hand like this and asking, what are we doing next? Because they need security guarantee. And the question is, what are we going to think about them? What are we going to do with them? Are we going to think that Moldova, Georgia are part of this European architecture, and that the region becomes a priority to us? Or is the region going to stay the same? So this is pretty much it.
Thank you, Gabriel. Of course, the role of Turkey as emerging major defense power in the region, seen across Central Asia before the war, also with Ukraine, where we saw all the importance of the drones, Bayraktar drones, in the war with Russia today. And that partnership has been nurtured by Turkey since 2015, when Turkey shut down the Russian military plane which crossed its border. The same strategy we have seen, of course, by Turkey in Azerbaijan during the military support in the Karabakh War, 2020, which allowed Azerbaijan to gain military advantage there, and the same role we see across Central Asia, as we see the role of China across the economic realm. And with that, we have to think, because of course Turkey has been considered by the region as a backdoor to NATO, or a troublesome NATO partner, maybe from the European perspective. The question is, now that we're seeing that the geopolitical tensions are coming to the military stage. How do we react in Europe? General Dominique Trinquant, how do we prepare, how do we react, especially given the war in Ukraine, no matter military partnerships with Turkey, no matter aligning its own military standard with NATO, years spent, etc. This has not deterred Russia. Maybe it has even given it a red kind of flashlight to go in and to start the invasion. How does Europe and how does NATO react today? How can we prepare for what's waiting for us going forward? What are your thoughts?
First, thank you very much for the invitation. You should put the map, please, on the screen. As an introduction, may I just quote Prince de Lampedusa, who said in French, I will translate in English, "Il faut que tout bouge pour que rien ne change." Everything has to move in order that there is no change. And in fact, that's exactly where we are. We are back to the 90s, before the 90s, where we are training to fight against the Warsaw Pact, and in fact Russia has attacked a European country, not a NATO country. I will focus mainly on Europe, and will leave NATO to General Yakovlev, who is a great specialist on NATO, and speak about Europe. On the map, it's very interesting to see that what is the difference between NATO and European Union is that the European pillar of NATO is mainly done by European country from EU. The addition, of course, and it's not a small addition, it's US. I'm not forgetting Canadian, if there are Canadian there, but the big increase is, of course, US, and the command is, of course, a US. But if you look at the map, you will see that you've got in green, at the top, Sweden and Finland. Very interesting to see that they are asking to join NATO. But in fact, inside EU, as some of you know, there is Article 42.7. Article 42.7 is roughly the equivalent of Article 5 from NATO, meaning that if these countries are currently attacked by Russia, EU country should react. And if EU country react, NATO, of course, will react. So the fact that these two countries are joining NATO is not really changing the nature of their relation, because they are training already a lot with NATO through the Partnership for Peace. But the fact that the presentation is to the Russian, is to tell them, look, now we are part of the same alliance. So when I'm talking about the relation between EU and NATO, may I have a word on the relation with France? Because of course my country has a specific story with NATO. Everybody thinks that France have been out from NATO, and with President Sarkozy came back in NATO. Just let me tell you a small story. In 86, 88, I was planning officer in 2nd Army Corps in Germany. At that time, France was not part of the integrated command from NATO, but the 2nd Corps was the reserve of the army group of NATO in Germany, meaning that France has never think of fighting against the Warsaw Pact, or now Russia, without NATO. We should have that in our head. But on the other side, President Macron, a few months ago, was talking about the brain death of NATO. That's where things are moving without changing. Because in fact, at that time, you remember just a few months later, there was the catastrophe in Kabul. All the Europeans were looking and say, what's happening? NATO was not involved. We were not warned about what's happening. So there was a tremble a bit in NATO. But of course, the crisis since, say, December, but the real war since February, changed many things. And now you will see that we have been working in Europe through the what we call the strategic compass, where France wanted that European country thinks by themselves about the threat and the future in defense terms. And at that time, France, of course, was looking south to the Sahel region in Africa. And was saying, well, NATO will not be involved in this region, but Europeans need to be involved in this region. And a big work was done by Europe on the strategic compass. But the conclusion of this study was provided second week of March, meaning roughly 3 or 4 weeks after the start of the war in Ukraine. That means that in 4 weeks, Europeans have to change several things inside the strategic compass. Where we are now is that 2 points are very important. European country needs to be united in facing the threat in Europe. First point. Second point, they have to be united with the major allied in Europe, which is the US, through NATO. Meaning that now, currently, we've got the European pillar of NATO. European need to be united. That's probably why today you've got this visit in Kiev from President Macron, Chancellor for Germany, and the Italian Prime Minister. Why? Because we know that in Europe there was several points different from the eastern part of Europe, which have been occupied by the Soviet Union. We need to remind that. And the western part, who have not been occupied and who have interest with Russia, especially in energy terms for Germany and Italy, for example. So it was very important that today they show that they are united with other Europeans in supporting Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that in the future we don't have to think about the future of defense, European defense, not separate but autonomous from the American. Why? You remember that 4 years ago what the Trump administration was saying, NATO, I'm not interested, Article 5, I will not apply. What will be the American administration in 3 years' time? I don't know. But us, Europeans, will be there and will have to face different threats. That's why, at the same time, we've got to be united in NATO and face the threat we've got currently within NATO, but we've got to think about the fact that in the future, perhaps the US interest will be elsewhere, and we'll have alone to face something. So that's why we've got a big work to do in operation and standardization, mainly within the framework of NATO, because NATO have done that for years. Standardization of procedure, operation, they know how to do it, and the Europeans are inside. They don't have to invent something else. But for example, in equipment, we need to be careful about the fact that we are not buying elsewhere all the time, and so degrading our capacity to have our own equipment. This is very important. And the fact that we, in operational terms, must be prepared to do it in a certain way, not now, in 10 years. You know, Europe is a long way to go. We are 27 countries with 27 different history, way of looking at things. We've got to work together for the future, and at the same time, fight, if I can say fight, we'll see with General Yakovlev what do we mean. But within NATO, because we need that currently, and I said we never think and dream, even before, of course, the 90s, but since to fight against a big power like Russia without our major allies, the US, within NATO. But we need to think of other threats where we need Europeans to be autonomous, first to assess the threat, then to deploy the means we've got to have in order to fight this threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Franquin. We are now going to turn to the issue of logistics. When in the conditions of war and what we've seen in Ukraine, it's not just about this supply, steady and high supply of military equipment, especially during the war of such intensity, where the personnel losses on Ukrainian side have been reported between 100 and 200 people dead and about 800 people wounded a day. Among the military alone, there you're talking also about all of the logistics which comes with, for example, providing military treatment to the wounded personnel. And with hundreds of hospitals entirely destroyed by Russian bombing, that whole logistics has been brought to nothing. We are now going to give the word to Gilles de Pederet to tell us about his company's experience with providing that logistics in Ukraine and what challenges that entails. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry because I will not be a really high-level discussion. I will be really more mud in the boots and really in reality. What happened is 2 weeks after the beginning of the war, of course, you can imagine that my company, which is doing a rapid deployment system like mobile hospitals, has been asked many times by many people to such a request of accommodations, sheltering. And inside this, I would say inside this mess of many requests, there's been one that has been highlighted from a facility management that was asked by the Australian government to put a mobile hospital for the civilians that were refugees but still inside the western part of Ukraine. I would like maybe to just highlight a few things. First of all, like you're a private company, of course, crisis time is something which is quite difficult, and it's really completely different from a urgent request from any customer. The first thing, and maybe you can just go just after, please, once again. Yeah. The first thing is when you have an urgent request, everything is very clear. When you have such a request, like in the two first weeks of the war, you know that you have something to erect. You don't know how many beds has to be put, how many doctors has to be inside the base camp. You don't know where is it. Is it inside Ukraine? Is it at the border? So many questions are raised, and so it's always difficult to do like a standard, I would say, thinking of a private company. So in this case, well, let's go back to basics. You need to go back to crisis task force, and so that I erect inside my company a specific dedicated crisis team, so that we can manage in parallel of all these different questions we will be raised, and also during also that the fact that the political situation was not stable, it permits us to raise questions to our future partner that will raise questions to the key political decision makers. So help the client to define clearly what he wants, what he can, where he wants to go, where he is allowed to go, has been a really tough questions. The second thing is in more internal issues. It's when you have any input every day, every hour that changes, you need to reshuffle inside your team to say, hey, it's not anymore in the West, it's in the Eastern. What does that mean? What are the risks? what can we do, what are our capabilities. And for this, I would say the first message, of which is maybe obvious, but the first message in my activity is to have enough stock, because the request is so changing that if you are not able to put the infrastructure for a 50-bed hospital, it's really, of course, different if you put surgery, if you put different medical acts. So have a stock capacity, be able to reactivate your production suppliers or your production factories is also, of course, really key on this. The second thing which is really important I would like to share is also that it's about logistics and risk assessment. First, logistics. Here is the map where all the different points is where I needed to take some specific equipment. And I'm just only talking about the infrastructure of the hospital. My partner also has to put all the medical equipments that were inside. So it's really a European, I would say, initiative and the supplier web that has been activated from Portugal, from Italy, many parts in France, and of course, when the politics says, okay, let's go, time is for execution, and the time is running very fast, because of course there is 1 to 3 to 4 days of transport for this. What is also, what does bring this kind of crisis team that you need to put inside your company? It brings mindset, it brings, of course, collective intelligence. This collective intelligence gives the risk assessment. Risk assessment means you need to raise questions that you will never, I would say, answer before the green light. So if you wait for the green light, you will never go there. If you do not wait, but you do not raise these different questions, you are completely unconscious. So let's give some examples. The first one, my company is very experienced in deploying people in the war zones. For example, we are present in the Sahel zones. And clearly, our war insurance are very tricky. There is always an asterisk inside our different insurance. So you need to ring the bell and to say, hey, my insurance, does this cover this country which is now in war? And the time they answer is not our time. So you need to raise this question before in advance, because otherwise it's really a no-go to put your people inside. There's many other, I would say, issues that has been raised, like the checkpoint, where to enter, where to find truck drivers, because many of the truck drivers are Ukrainian, and the ones who are not Ukrainian, are they volunteer to go inside a war zone at a time where it was maybe blitzkrieg, or not blitzkrieg, was war. So here are a lot of questions that has been raised, and through this type of organization, you can really think that you can make it happen and erect in 3 days a mobile hospital for the civilians and make it operational. And after I let just some photos, okay, that's already, just to see what happened in the suburbs.
Please tell us
Lviv.
where did you put up the mobile hospitals? How much time it took, and who was?
So I put up the hospital in close to Lviv, in Zevada, and it took 3 days to erect more than 20 structures, so that there has been a pediatric, many types of medical tents to care all the civilians that were coming from the eastern part.
Thank you very much. And with that, we give the word to the last speaker, Michel Yakovlev, who would address the most complex question: what should NATO do with Russia?
Thanks.
I was told in my younger years, if you talk, either be brilliant or be brief. So my controlling idea, and after that you can leave, is that NATO is at war, and if it does not realize, it will lose. For the same reason that if my wife wants to divorce me, and I don't believe it, I will lose the divorce and it will be a complete rip-off. So first point, NATO must recognize that it is at war, and it doesn't right now. When Putin talks of humiliation or a new architecture security, he's not talking Ukraine, he's talking NATO. So currently, it's not that there is a war in Ukraine and that NATO is secondary. It is that Putin is at war against NATO and that Ukraine is secondary. Ukraine is the theater where the war is happening. And as long as NATO does not play, it will lose by definition. If you don't fight a war, you lose. Now, what would mean winning the war? What would it look like? Basically, irrespective of where the line is drawn, to win a war is to bring home to both sides the hard realities of power. Today, there is an equation, who is more powerful than whom, and we are solving that equation. It is the only language that Putin understands, the hard reality of power. So if the West wins, and when I say the West, it's Ukraine and basically all of us, what I'd call the civilized world in this case, well, then we will set the terms for the Russian regime, because by that time I have a suspicion that President Putin will have jumped out of the window, unfortunately. And you face the consequences, either in terms of territory or, for example, reconstruction, reparation, and so on. There is a debate about let's not humiliate. Well, I'm sorry, when you face the consequences, if you feel humiliated, c'est la vie. Too bad, you tried it and you lost. Now, since we, NATO, are not doing the war, the current prospect is that we will lose it. And therefore, what does victory look like for Russia? Well, first of all, for all of us in Europe, we go back to Finlandization, which is conditional sovereignty. And the word conditional means that it depends on what the Russian regime thinks our sovereignty is and where it applies. We are sovereign to the degree that the Putin regime or his successors would agree. It also implies economic subservience, just like the former satellites had it. There was a joke at the time that the difference between these two sources of energy, the sun and coal, is that the sun goes west and the coal goes east. And this is what we'll face. And also, of course, an unraveling of all our positions in the world, what we conceive of our relationship with the world. Now, this would be the consequence of our defeat at the hands of the Russians. Today, militarily speaking, on the ground, neither side has collapsed. I don't think any side is close to collapsing, but even if one side collapses, the other side is too exhausted to take advantage of it. Even if the Ukrainian army collapses, the Russian army is too weak in its current state to march all the way back to Kiev. And if the Russian army collapses in the Donbass, the Ukrainian army is too weak to reconquer Donbass. In essence, we're close to a truce. Now, how ready is NATO for war? Well, first of all, as I've said, we're not in the fight. We haven't been since 2014,
and we are paying the consequences. So what does it mean if we join the fight? Basically, it's seize the moment or prepare for the next one. Either NATO decides to do something directly, basically now, or it lets the war exhaust itself in Ukraine and it prepares for the next round. Either you do it now or you wait for the next turn. If we seize the moment right now, it just happens that we are at this turning point now. It could be a limited war in Ukraine and over Ukraine. And this exists in the strategic concept of the Russians signed off by President Putin at the time, if I remember well, 2015. The concept of limited war, in the sense that Russia and NATO territory are sanctuarized, but other than that, everything goes, in this case, in Ukraine. And that actually is a result of the discussion of 10 days ago about which missiles would be given by the Americans to the Ukrainians. HIMARS, 80 kilometers, acceptable to the Russians. 300 kilometers, not acceptable. It's not an operational debate. It's a new change of mind. It's an implicit agreement from President Putin that he will agree to a limited war, not limited in terms of the assets used, but limited geographically. Just like Vietnam or Korea. You do war in Korea, you don't cross the Yalu into China. And in this case, so the advantage with this, for me, new situation is that it would enable NATO to participate directly in operations in Ukraine without triggering the complete nuclear war. For example, the Ukrainians have a problem with counter-battery, not because they don't have the artillery, it's because they don't have the whole system and the doctrine and the training, the collective knowledge. We could have NATO forces provide counter-battery in Ukraine. The same would apply to air defense. Very complicated to give Patriots away. Well, move in with your Patriots and do air defense and potentially air coverage. And if the Russians say this is escalatory, well, look, Vladimir, you have tanks in Ukraine, I do. You have artillery in Ukraine, so do I. You have aircraft flying over Ukraine, fine with me, as long as you agree that my aircraft fly over Ukraine. That is the concept of limited war. In this case, if we seize the moment, we have a chance of winning the war. Now, if we don't seize the moment, quite frankly, I think that's what's happening now, we prepare for the next one. The problem with the next one is that we're not sure we'll be ready, and it will still be at the initiative of the other side. They will crank it up when they feel ready. And that is not, in terms of strategy, not having the initiative is definitely not the good idea. And the stakes would be much larger, because by that time we would be discussing Suwalki, Romania or whatever, facing a reinvigorated Putin regime and China lurking behind. I have a suspicion China would very much enjoy trying Taiwan in the meantime. So, in conclusion, either we accept this war and fight it, or we lose it. And basically, we have two issues to sort out. It's ammunition and urban warfare. And both these aspects, NATO is not ready, not conceptually ready. But still, it will have to accept this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody. The questions, please pose to us right outside, so we can give the space to the next panelists. Thank you very much again, General Dominique Tronquin, Gabriel Valli, Gilles Del Pere, and General Michel Yakovlev. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you.